Hello there and welcome once again to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We're here every week meeting interesting people, dealing with topical issues, and what we got today is an international story that's certainly in the news.
It is a front page story in any newspaper that you look at. The situation in Ukraine and Crimea and its relationship with Russia is something that's got a lot of people nervous and a lot of other people talking about what could happen. And we happen to have, luckily, in Norman, Oklahoma, a lawyer by the name of Marc Nuttle who has represented the Ukraine, has been in that area of the world a lot and knows what's going on there and is up to date on the situation. He's been kind enough to give us his time today, come give us what we call an update on Crimea and the Ukraine. So we're going to talk to Marc Nuttle.
People talk about this as being political or military, but there's a business aspect to this, and because it has to do with oil and gas, it has a lot to do with Oklahoma directly and indirectly because of our exposure to the oil and gas interests. So it should be interesting to hear what Marc has to say.
It really should be.
Marc Nuttle, today's guest on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
I've always been a public servant. I've served either tribes, I've served the federal government, or I've served state governments. The law allows me to express my natural desire to advocate. My name is Stephanie Cochran. I am an attorney and I am Chickasaw. Lawyers give their clients, and in my case, tribal governments, a voice. And it's through legal decisions that tribes have been able to accomplish and to regain some much lost footing that they encountered in the late 1800s and the 1900s. When I reflect back on this time in history, I think I'll look at it in terms of opportunity. And I think now we have to turn those opportunities into long-term success for our future generations.
See more stories about the Chickasaw people at profilesofanation.com.
People have been talking about energy independence for a long time. It's always been popular, but today it's possible.
We have an enormous supply of oil and gas in the United States, much more than we thought just a few years ago.
New technology, massive new discoveries, largely made by Oklahoma companies. It literally changes everything.
And Oklahoma is leading the charge. Go watch this video to see why. Energy independence starts with us.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
We're really pleased to welcome back to the set of The Verdict for his 7th visit, an attorney out of Norman, Oklahoma, Marc Nuttle. Marc represents political entities. He represents cities, states, and nations around the world, actually. And he has advised the Ukraine and Bulgaria in the past on matters relating to their sovereignty and to their legal system. He has worked with President Reagan, Governor Bellman, Governor Bartlett, Senator Bartlett, Senator Inhofe, and a lot of other folks. He's on the ground, been in the East a number of times. Certainly, he's got some interesting stories to tell about tanks in the streets that he's observed. He has been on major networks, television and radio networks, on all of the major networks, all of the TV news shows, talking about his foreign travels and activities. And he's here to talk to us now to give us an update on the Ukraine and Crimea and what can we expect. Marc, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much.
Glad to have you.
Well, I'm just glad to be here.
It is good to have you back because I think a lot of people are at least vaguely aware of what's going on the other side of the world with Russia becoming more and more aggressive. And I think the idea of having you on is you can kind of explain what's their motive, what's their end game, and try to break into the psyche of the Russian interest in these areas. And we're talking primarily about Ukraine and Crimea.
Yes.
Well, so in general, there's a Soviet Union that breaks up over 20 years ago now. And Ukraine gets its independence. And all of a sudden there's unrest in the last few months, and all of a sudden Russia acts like they want Ukraine back. And I think a lot of people in the United States thought, well, wait a minute, I thought there was peaceful relations going on there. Why would Russia suddenly want to start putting the Soviet Union back together again?
As the current ambassador said, I thought we'd face these issues and solved them, but a brief history might be helpful. It's 1991. The Soviet Union is starting to collapse, but we don't know the extent of it yet. Ukraine senses it. Now, this is a country that has never assimilated into the Soviet Union. Ukrainians and Russians don't like each other. They don't live together. There was an ethnic cleansing, unless you go back about 160 years, the Cossacks and other things like that. But there was cultural cleansing. Ukrainian language was illegal. If you got caught speaking it, you could go to jail. So there was a lot of persecution to that extent. And they wanted to be independent as they sensed the Soviet Union was going to collapse. Boris Yeltsin's running for president of Russia. We're dealing with both at the same time. They asked for help from the United States. My employer was the National Endowment for the Democracy, which is a quasi-U.S. government agency funded by the U.S. government. I'm sent there to observe, but also to conduct the elections.
To Ukraine.
For Ukraine.
Yeah.
But remember, this was not a sovereign nation. It was an area of the Soviet Union called the Ukraine,
right.
mainly an agricultural area. They never dreamed, first, to keep in mind that it would ever be independent. They had built pipelines across there strategically to serve the outer edges, Poland and Romania, of the Soviet Union, which then became Western Europe. They had missiles there, nuclear missiles in Ukraine, which they would never place there if it was a sovereign nation. They didn't put them in Georgia or places like that they couldn't control. And they never expected it to be an open airport or an open city. And then, of course, the most important thing is Sevastopol, which was their port, warm water port on the Black Sea, Sevastopol. So given that, we go in and we conduct these elections. We didn't have ballot boxes. We had to get the French to print the ballots and things like that. And but we got it done, and they became independent. Had the Soviet Union not collapsed immediately thereafter, it would have been very difficult, I think, to maintain the Crimea position that they had, because basically Boris Yeltsin was more than open to a treaty. They had no place to move that port. That's where their Black Sea fleet's based. Couldn't have moved if they wanted to. And so by treaty, Ukraine decided to provide that service. Now what's happened is that Vladimir Putin, who I didn't know, he was still in the KGB when I was there, is of the KGB mentality that you don't trust treaties. You must control every asset that you want that's strategic to you. And so Yanukovych, which was his person that was the premier of Ukraine that was just ousted by the people, he came to the decision, I think, that the West had undermined this, and therefore he had to get Crimea back. Now remember, Crimea is primarily Russian population. There's also, I might just put this one map up. This just, is a map of Ukraine. You've seen this a lot on TV. It's a large area, mainly agriculture, and Crimea is down here on this port, is what we're talking about right now. This is Crimea. And the eastern Oblast, which is Donetsk, is also Russian. And you may find that one of these days they're going to want to succeed also. This is about 80% Russian population. Crimea was about 55 to 60%. And yes, they asked for annexation because they don't want to be ruled by Ukraine any more than Ukraine wants to be ruled by Russia. All right, now what does it mean? Let me just show you this quick picture show you how the port fits and how far this goes in the Black Sea and how close it is right here to the Russian connection and how important this was to them. But remember, it's the only warm water, deep water port that the Russian fleet has. Why is that important? Well, this next picture shows politically what was going on. This is the Black Sea. Here's Crimea. This was the outer limits of the Soviet Union. And also Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in the Baltics were occupied territory. The United States of America never recognized these nations as part of the Soviet Union, only occupied territory. And when we went there, we had to have armed guards because we never had permission to be there when we were working for their independence. Now, the other question in play is Moldavia, which is this independent country right here. And Putin has put out a decree that he has a responsibility to protect Russians wherever they live. Well, this went on, guys, for about 50 years. So you've got Russian diplomats, administrations, central headquarters, TV stations, communication systems all throughout this region that had to be dismantled. And before I show you this next chart, think of it this way. Let's say 10 counties in southwestern Oklahoma just decided they didn't like Oklahoma anymore. And they decided to succeed and join Texas. And Texas was glad to have that. So, well, yeah, we'd like to have the landmass. But OG&E's got power stations there. We've got pipelines there. We've got infrastructure inside there. And how do you then reassemble and rearrange the power grid, this is an example, between now what was you always thought would be Oklahoma is now part of Texas. That's what happened on missiles, pipelines, and the Black Sea Fleet. Now, why is this Black Sea Fleet so important? And then what does it mean to the United States? This is the picture of the Middle East. Up here is Crimea. So here's the top of what I just showed you. Here's what the fleet is. Syria is Russia's client state. To service Syria in the Middle East, they have to have this deep water port. Without this, they're out of business in the Middle East. And that is their main client right now.
Well, are they denied access without military or political takeover
To
that deep water port? Are
no,
they
but the treaty was in place. I mean, this has been going on. This is 22 and a half years
then
ago.
what changed?
What changed was that Putin did not have a person in charge of Ukraine that was his agent.
Well,
Now,
Ukraine has leadership issues. Is that safe to say?
Well, yes, they do. And a couple of things. First, on this leadership, on this president issue, on Yanukovych, what Putin is worried about, in his KGB mind, now this is my opinion, because I can't come to any other conclusion based upon the facts. He believes the West is trying to undermine the Russian position in the world. And so if NATO moves further into Ukraine, Ukraine moves to the West. This was supposedly the problem. What sparked all this is that Ukraine was going to have closer economic and military ties to the West. Then that treaty would come into jeopardy as we played with it on Crimea. That was his concern. And so take over Ukraine or take Crimea back and take it out of play. That's what's going on here.
What's been NATO's reaction?
Well, it's been benign, and partly because of our lack of leadership. And there's a couple other things going on. Why is it benign? Why doesn't Germany and Great Britain join us immediately? Well, first, Russia is a cash and carry state. 80% of their exports are oil and gas. They live off cash flow. And they have debt and other things that they do for infrastructure, but primarily they live on cash. That cash is cleared in London. It's bought in dollars, and before it's distributed back into the ruble or any of their other currencies in their client states, it goes through London banks and London clearinghouse. And London is in a very bad position to impose sanctions when it's the primary financial officer for the purchase and selling of oil and gas in Russia. Germany gets 35% of its gas from these pipelines across Ukraine, and they don't want to disrupt it. They can't replace it in the short term. Germany's moving more into nuclear energy, but it's a generational deal, 20 years. And so they've not stepped forward. And the French need it. The French need the gas. So the problem is, your question on NATO, they have not been supportive on sanctions or doing anything to stop him. But the reason I show you these maps, particularly the one on Lithuania, if he starts to go that far, NATO will engage. They'll have to.
Let's take a break and then come back and start to bring this home. How could this affect the oil and gas industry in the United States and the rest of the world? Marc Nuttle's our guest. We're watching The Verdict.
When you have something important to communicate, it becomes clear that there's a lot of competition for your audience's attention. So how can your message stand out and actually resonate with your audience? Legal Graphics has the answers. The team at Legal Graphics will work with you to plan, design, and even test your presentation to ensure your message will be heard and remembered. Call Legal Graphics today to schedule an appointment. The readiness is all.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
Welcome back to the Set of the Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers and our guest Marc Nuttle. We've been exploring all of the aspects of Russia's sudden interest in Ukraine and Crimea. And Marc's been kind enough to kind of take us through a little bit of the history. But I'd like to now figure out, how does this affect Oklahoma? How could Oklahoma's economy be affected by what's taking place over there?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, if Russia was able to move with abandon and control these gas markets, they can set prices, it would it could hurt the price effect.
Just like a cartel?
Yeah, well, yes. There's one thing that kind of went unnoticed. At the height of the rhetoric, Premier Putin said, look, if you continue with sanctions, I'm going to consider taking the next step and enter a market that does not recognize the dollar as a primary currency for oil and gas. And it's a petrodollar he's talking about. So it tells you two things. One, somebody's talking about that. But second, you mentioned China. China's also been exploring this, not because they want to do it. They're worried about how we're managing the dollar and what the price and currency will be to them and when they have to buy raw materials. And so we have to be careful about China for two reasons. One, that it would be disastrous if that happened, by the way. It wouldn't work, but it would really disrupt the commodities markets. But second, the other play in this is Iran. And both China and Russia do not want the U.S. to dominate Iran because it gives us too much influence in the Middle East. This doesn't have so much to do with economics, it's just geopolitical policy. And you don't want to drive those two guys together. They're not basically natural partners. Now, but what does this do to Oklahoma? It affects the price. It affects the price of oil and gas. It can impact the price of banking and for our exports if we do export. And we do export now some. We trade a lot of oil and gas to the coast that we use externally and then we use internally. It can affect those prices.
And are you saying that the price could go lower?
Yes, it could go lower. If what I would like to see, of course, is energy independence. Export all the oil and gas that we can that we don't need. I would promote LNG and export of liquefied natural gas to the European market. At least Denmark and Holland and some countries like that would take it, and the Germans would if they knew that it was safe. And
that's exported by ship?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you think that Russia can take over Ukraine without firing shots?
Oh, it's possible, Kent, but what he really wants, what Putin wants, is to break it up into autonomous regions that have no central authority.
Divide and conquer.
Divide them so that they have no central authority, therefore they have no economic impact and can't stop anything he's doing.
Well, how closely tied are those regions to each other? I mean, historically they are tied, I guess, as part of the Ukraine.
Except for Crimea and except for the Eastern Oblast, it's a homogenous country of Ukrainians, and they would stay together. But they need economic help, and we should be providing economic help. We should promote UN and IMF loans, and we should make some ourselves. I think today Congress passed an aid package for Ukraine. We should have done it about 6 weeks ago.
Mark, what we saw in Egypt and some other places is the rise of social media as sort of a catalyst towards civil unrest. I'm not seeing that in some of these former Soviet Union countries, and I'm just wondering if it's just through years of Soviet occupation, their expectations are low, and they don't have necessarily a next generation that's exposed to the West and wanting to see all these Western ideas and thoughts and wanting to rid themselves of the past.
Well, Ukraine, though, is the closest former Soviet province to the West. Borders Poland and close to Germany.
Closest in proximity.
In proximity. Okay. And they do have some
They have Western exposure.
They do. And in fact, when I was there, I might just tell you the story, Mick. When Gorbachev called the tanks out and we're in the middle of these independent elections, we didn't know what to do. And he said there was a price to pay for freedom. And we didn't know what he meant. And what he was pointing to was Czechoslovakia, which is now Czechoslovakia, and the bloodshed in 1956 in Czechoslovakia when they wanted independence. We didn't have an embassy in Kiev, so I had to go to Moscow to the attaché to get direction on what to do. And George Herbert Walker Bush was president, and he inquired, and his word back through the attachés and Jim Baker, Secretary of State, was, we don't think he'll pull the trigger, but it's a Ukrainian decision. You've got to decide and let the Ukrainians decide. So I took that message back, and the colonel in charge of the protection of Ukraine, I look out the window and see his tanks in the street where we're meeting, and said, how long will it be? And he had exposure to the West. He had seen freedom. He saw what a marketplace could do. He saw grocery stores and open schools and education, and just basically a person being able to direct their family as they saw fit. And he asked the question, how long will it be before my children have the freedom and the prosperity and opportunity your children do? And I knew it was a serious question. I thought about it and I said, well, Colonel, I don't know if in your lifetime, but in your children's lifetime, and your grandchildren's lifetime. Then he said, that's a worthy price to pay for freedom. And he decided to conduct the elections and they became independent. Now, that was as a direct reflection of exposure to the West.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the end game here. If the United States and the West are successful in imposing sanctions, economic sanctions, how successful will they be, and how does Putin react?
Well, first, we can be very successful with sanctions. This is a fragile economy. It's literally one-tiered. I mean, they do make vodka and caviar and a few other things that they export, but not at the level that could sustain that economy. It's oil and gas. I mean, they're a petro nation state living on cash flow, as I said. You freeze those assets around the world, and you can stop them in their tracks. But then, what does that mean, and at what price? And with that military power, what does that mean? So,
well, is this just a bluff then by Putin? I mean, if he can't sustain it long term without ruining his economy,
he doesn't think we'll do it.
He doesn't think we'll impose a sanction.
And so far, Europe hasn't said they will.
Yeah, U.S. has, but Europe has not.
Correct.
And it's going to take something to push them into the sanctioning mode.
And I don't think it was by mistake, Kent, that the first sanctions the president imposed were against individuals. I don't remember that. I don't remember that happening before. Where it's against individuals and not corporate assets and bank accounts.
Yeah.
Because there still is an oligarchy there. There are several rich citizens that have multiple billions of dollars that influence the economy that they thought that would impact. They would go talk to me about it. Well, they kind of got their money out, I'm told, and they've moved it. And so it kind of out of the reach. And now we'll see. I believe that the NATO alliance, the UN, will step in to the point that he will not invade, other than he may try to get a corridor to Crimea or negotiate that. The Ukrainians may agree to it, because they can't stand an onslaught. Hold their country together.
No, they can't defend themselves against Russia.
No, in no way, on any level. Hand-to-hand combat or airplanes or anything else. And so that may still occur. I'd be surprised if he goes past that to Moldavia or Lithuania. He won't get to Lithuania. That will not happen. And so it'll stop at that point. Now, what mischief will he play in other former Soviet sovereign nations? Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan or places like that were you don't hear about through social media because of maybe their culture, and they are more isolated, and they are further away, and they're closer to Mongolia and China in that area of the world, and maybe a little slower than to get there than say Ukraine. He may, but I don't know how strategic those are. This was strategic because of pipelines and location, but primarily, as much as anything else, that deep water port, the Sevastopol.
And we're trying to read between the lines. If China is forced to choose between supporting the West and some sort of economic sanctions and its allegiance to Russia, they choose Russia?
Well, another thing I would say is I'm not sure it's allegiance to Russia. It's in their own best interest to keep Russia powerful in the region, to keep the United States at balance.
Keep their enemy closer.
Right.
And they're a customer, are they not?
Yes, oh yes. And they're part, if there's a cartel out there trying to replace the dollar for the purchasing and selling of oil and gas, China's involved in it.
How long is it going to take for this situation to play out? When are we going to know approximately whether Ukraine falls or stands?
Oh, I think months, not years.
Not years,
no. Yeah. I think just harboring 40,000 troops on the border is expensive and not strategic or sensible. I think months.
Well, we have less than a minute to go. The president's been reacting. Your response on the steps he's taken? I'm
supportive of what he's doing now. My question is, why didn't we do this 6 months ago when Ukraine was asking for help? They needed $15 billion in aid. They had to petition the EU for it. The EU was being cautious about what that meant to Russia. We should have stepped in right then, became their partner, sent our best consultants to advise them on how to rebuild their country, given them technological aid and brought them into our realm. We should have then, at the same time, moved NATO closer to the border for defense, for no other reason than just they're part of what normal NATO would have done in that realm. And then he would have been facing the West when he approached Crimea, not Ukraine.
He'd have done it more gingerly then, probably.
Absolutely.
Sounds like we may need to have you back on in a few months for an update.
Yeah, you're going to have to keep us informed.
Marc Nuttle, today's guest on The Verdict. We'll be right back with a final word.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
You have children come from a different lifestyle, different mindset. You have to open your arms and really do what you have to do to have that child become a part of your family. And if it's more patience, that's what you do. Kids gotta know they can trust you. And that's what we try to do with these kids.
You will always be mom and dad to me.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
We're back on The Verdict, wrapping up a show with Marc Nuttle. He was explaining a lot of the intricate details between Russia and their reactions in Crimea and the Ukraine.
Yeah, we put about 2 hours worth of information in 18 minutes with Marc, but he did a really good job of summarizing it and letting us know what's at issue, what's at stake, what are the goals and likely positions of the parties in the area. I was pleased to hear him say that he thinks it's going to be a matter of months, not years, before it's resolved. Well, the last thing we need is another extended controversy overseas about something or another. But he did a grand job, and we appreciate it.
Well, and there are a lot of economic implications, and you would love for someone to be acting as if they were a graduate of the Harvard Business School and not the KGB.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
Unfortunately, that's the way Putin reacts, and that's his background, and we're all trying to sit here and sort this out. We have a website, theverdict.tv. If you'll go there, we'll see you next week.